Okay, so thank you to everyone for joining us for this week's Crisis Management webinar. For those of you who don't know me, I am Jonathan Hemus. I am the Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy. We help leaders of businesses to prepare, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their corporate lives, everything from product contamination through to environmental incidents, serious accidents, and sadly, over the last couple of months, pandemics. And I am very pleased to be joined on the webinar this afternoon by Stephen Stewart. Stephen, welcome.
Afternoon.
And Steve is the Director of Corporate Communications for Stagecoach, one of the leading UK transport groups. Steve is responsible for corporate communications at Stagecoach and has indeed been involved in communication initially as a journalist and latterly in-house for 30 years now. So yet again, I'm joined on the line by another person that brings 3 decades of experience to this subject. And clearly, Stagecoach, as a significant transport operator, has been very much in the forefront of the COVID-19 response. And I'm delighted that Steve is going to be sharing with us both learnings from throughout his career in communication, but also specifically what Stagecoach has done to use communication to retain the trust of its stakeholders during this very, very challenging time. So again, thank you, Steve, for joining us. And I guess my first question would be, how do you set about managing crises at Stagecoach? And, how's your team made up? What role does your chief executive play?
Yeah, I think the key thing is that there's a number of building blocks that really need to be in place well before any crisis hits.
Yeah.
The first of those really is understanding your risk areas. And I think regardless of whether you're in transport, manufacturing, the supply chain, financial services, public sector, we all know that we've got risks in our areas. Clearly for ourselves, when you're undertaking lots of different journeys on vehicles right across the country every minute of the day, there's lots of them. So there's also ones related to being a listed company as well. So understand your risks. Secondly, we've got a multifunctional crisis management team in place, which is led by our chief executive. We've got about 10 people from different business areas that are involved there, ranging from the chief exec, finance director level, through to communications, safety, information, IT, and other specialists across customer, business development, technology, and change. So it's having the broad breadth of the team. The third thing is you need a plan, and that's both a business plan and a communications plan. So we've worked for many years to get both a sort of business continuity plans in place and also crisis communication plans, so that we've got all the roles and responsibilities identified, the issues that we know are going to come up, process maps and timelines, and all the messaging that we want to deploy around that. And I think in terms of, the role of the CEO, critical role that, the leadership in all crises is extremely important. You'll see that from the ones that have been handled really well, and you'll also see that from the ones that have turned out badly. So that our CEO activates the team, leads the strategic response, but also it's a very collegiate thing, taking input from specialists across the group. You really need to have a broad church of people that can provide advice to the CEO, and a CEO who's got both a business brain and a human touch, which I think is critical. We'll maybe come on to that. And then stress test your plan and learn not just from what happens in your own sector, but others.
Yeah, no, that all makes perfect sense. And one thing I wanted to add and one thing I wanted to explore with you. One is you mentioned understanding your risk landscape, and it's a drum I'm banging particularly hard at the moment, because I think in the light of COVID-19, actually the risk landscape that organisations are facing now is different to the one that they were facing, 6 or 8 weeks ago, in the sense that, those organisations are more vulnerable now than ever before, and you don't have the full resources that you might have had at your disposal a couple of months ago. So I'd simply say to the people on this call, please do take a proper look at your risk landscape right now, because say what was accurate at the beginning of this year may not be an accurate representation of what you're facing now. And the second thing I just wanted to explore with you, Steve, I know that you have a very collaborative culture within the organisation and within your leadership team. What role does the culture of the organisation play in your ability to manage crises effectively?
I think that our culture, we're a very entrepreneurial organisation, and with entrepreneurial organisations, you tend not to have weighty corporate structures like others might expect to have. Just to put it in context, in our communications team, there's myself and my colleague who's the group head of media and public affairs. Now, we have got individuals on the ground who are at a level below that we can use, but we've got very short chains of command.
Yeah.
So you have to be absolutely crystal clear on what everyone's role is, to make sure that you're managing the situation the best you can.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. Clearly, in a crisis, you have to move quickly and you have to be able to make quick decisions. And I think that culture you have and that structure that you have really lends to that kind of speed of action and clarity of decision making. You touched on it in your previous answer, Steve. What role does training and exercising play in your preparedness for crises?
Yeah, that's absolutely critical. Again, that plays into the, by the time a crisis hits, you've already got a lot of these building blocks in place. Yeah. So every year we carry out an annual scenario exercise. Yeah. These plans that we've got are absolutely useless if they just gather dust on a shelf.
Yeah.
And that's about making sure that we're in the best shape possible for any particular challenges that we face. And there's a few things that we do around about that and do about the training. It's about stretching the team.
Yeah.
We put a lot of thinking into the actual exercises that we do. There's no point revisiting the same old scenarios that you're probably more prepared for than others, rather than the ones like we've got now where, things come from a bolt from the blue. Yeah. The other thing about it is it provides a safe environment for everyone. This is an environment that is ideal, really, because you can make the mistakes, and you will make them.
Yeah.
But you can make them in a very safe environment and learn, and also build the confidence of people, because even senior executives need to have their confidence built when they're dealing with big crises and also having to face the media. I think we also want to involve the right people at the right levels, and that involves not just your senior leaders. That involves us thinking about who at the different levels of the organisation are really critical gatekeepers, who are the ones that when it comes to practical delivery are really going to be critical in making sure that we've got an effective response.
Yeah.
And it also allows us to review our processes. Are there gaps? Are we making assumptions about certain things? I know that the last scenario exercise that we did, which involved a cyber issue, and of course that was an issue that when we looked at our risk areas, we thought that was one that was rising up the tree, and we've seen evidence this week with EasyJet being hit by an incident like that. We reviewed our processes and found some gaps, some resourcing gaps, some ways that we could have done things more effectively. Also, we look at the sort of channels that we have to communicate, and this is a classic example, COVID-19, where all of the old assumptions we made about being able to deal with things went out the window with social distancing, workplaces being closed, etc. And then, you review your operational and crisis plans themselves. And also there's an important media side of this in terms of making sure that the spokespeople for your organisation are prepared to project themselves as best they can to win people's trust and avoid any damaging impact on your credibility. And that is not necessarily your top CEO. That could be specialists in different areas. You want the right people for the right job.
Absolutely. And I think, again, I would very much endorse the value of exercising and in particular creating that safe environment. And I think it's important that when people do run exercises, they do create that safe environment, that psychological safety, that people really don't feel as though it is a test where they will pass or fail or be blamed. The real benefit of an exercise is exactly what you've said, Steve, that it is a safe environment. It's an opportunity to make mistakes so that you don't make mistakes in a real situation and build up that muscle memory of what does work. So I'd commend everyone, yes, to hold exercises, but make sure they are done in the right kind of spirit. So I guess building on all of that, Steve, how did all of the planning, all of the training, all of the exercising, all of the experience help you to respond to COVID-19?
I think the first thing actually was being able to identify that we had a potential crisis quite early.
Yeah.
And I think that's been an interesting one, this, because I suppose it's what I would call a creeping crisis compared to other crises, which can be instant and right in your face to a particular incident. I mean, we were quite lucky in a way that we used to operate services in Hong Kong, so we had the experience of SARS in the early 2000s and how that could impact on transport operations. So we did have an insight into how this could escalate. But I think when we did our exercise last year, and we based it, as I said, around about cybersecurity and a data breach issue, and actually that showed us that something that initially looked small very quickly became quite a big issue for us as a company, particularly from a consumer-facing point of view. So identifying the crisis early was a good learning point. The second point was about having the right people that were part of our team. We'd structured the exercise so that we had senior leaders, obviously, from different areas, but there were some gaps in the specialists that I think that we needed to have to hand. So that was really important, because any crisis, responding in a timely manner is really important, and having the people ready immediately saves you time. We tested a mix of having people in the room and also having people on the end of the phone and working on social media. And actually, that's exactly how this crisis has panned out. I mean, none of us are in the room together today. We're doing, Microsoft Teams regularly throughout the day. We're using all different channels. And if we just relied on physical proximity for our processes, we would have been in real trouble.
Yes.
I think the fourth thing is around about learning how important internal communications are in a crisis. I come from a media background, and certainly the instinct of a lot of people, and it's always my immediate instinct, is to think externally, how's this going to play out? What's the issue here? But actually, I would say that the big learning experience has been how important having effective internal communications is with your own people. And that actually has helped drive, I would hope, the view that we have handled things fairly well, having a good relationship with our people. And the fifth thing is all about the gaps. We identified some gaps with our scenario. We've used them to plug them and do that in a way that fits with our leaner structure, because with a lean structure, we just weren't in a position to add huge amounts of resource. It's really using flexing the resource we've got more effectively and using internal gatekeepers to extend the reach of our communications.
Got you. So, I mean, again, it's really interesting that although the exercise we ran with you last year was a cyber incident, which one would think has no linkage to a pandemic, actually a number of the very specific learnings were immediately transferable. And one of the things, again, I would pick out of that for those on this call is that don't treat your exercises as a rehearsal of specifically how to deal with that particular crisis. Yes, of course, it will have particular benefit if that crisis emerges in future, but it's at least equally important to draw out of it more general learnings, and the exercise, as well as enabling you to consider a particular scenario, is very much about rehearsing the ways of working and identifying why or how those ways of working might not be so effective if they're put under real pressure in a crisis. So it's really good to hear that in your instance that actually happens, Steve. But perhaps moving specifically onto communication, how did you define your communication objectives as this situation began? What were your communication objectives?
I think there's probably two sides to this. There's the sort of priorities in terms of communications priorities that we set both for the crisis management team and how they handle the incident, and also the sort of framework that we work within when we look to do that. So just touching on the framework first.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned it in your opening remarks about culture, and I think everyone knows that before you hit a crisis, people already have a perception of you as an organisation. So you're already going into this environment with people with particular perceptions, and I think you really need to be have a response that's consistent with your company values and be true to what you are. You will never be able to suddenly present yourself as something different. Right in the heat of battle, dealing with a crisis like this. The second sort of principle, that involves honesty and integrity. I think it involves showing that you're accountable and responsible as an organisation, and also transparent, and all of that sort of wraps itself up in what I think is key to managing crises effectively, and it's around about maintaining the long-term trust, confidence, and support of the stakeholders that you've got, whether that's employees, customers, suppliers, investors, government, and to do that, you make decisions that are based on doing the right thing. It's very easy, I think, for organisations to think, right, what do we do to get ourselves out of a hole here? But that actually doesn't help you in the long term with your reputation. So doing the right thing has been a sort of core objective right throughout everything that we have done in this crisis and in other crises. And also having the flexibility to adapt to a changing environment. I mean, COVID-19 it's been a whirlwind. I mean, some things that we were still doing 2 months ago, you would actually throw your hands up in horror at doing them now. So you need to have that flexibility. And I think as well, our objectives is to see opportunity and not just risk. In many businesses, your natural instinct might be to bunker down, keep your head low. But actually, if you're looking at how businesses have commercially been able to pivot and identify new opportunities, that has actually been some of these businesses' saviour. So these are some of the principles. In terms of the priorities, communications-wise, yes, doing the right thing, being human. I mean, at the end of the day, the absolute priority throughout this crisis, if there's been one thing, is taking care of people. If you take care of people, a lot of the other things will follow. You will be able to take care of your reputation, it will help you as you try to take care of the rest of your business. The second thing is taking control and also being visible and showing that you're actually in your own area, and COVID-19 is massive. I mean, there's so many dimensions to it, but in your own area that you're taking control. Having a two-way conversation as well. You can actually get some really important understanding from stakeholders that you work with. What are their priorities? What are the concerns that they've got? And that can help inform how you respond to that, whether it's things to do with your supply chain, your customers, your investors. And as I was saying early on, really think about that long-term future, because there comes a point, and I think we as a country are starting to get to this point where, as we're easing out of lockdown, we're actually thinking about, right, what's the new normal look like? How does our industry, our sector, our company look like moving forward? So if you can show that thought leadership on the future, I think it really sets you in good stead as well.
So some really fantastic and practical principles there for people to think about, caring for people at the forefront, and that simple phrase, doing the right thing, and letting that lead everything that you do and say. I'd like to kind of explore that a little bit, Steve. How do you as an organization stay true to that when you have, financial pressures, commercial pressures, legal advice, which might be pointing in a slightly different direction? How do you stay true to that, motto of simply doing the right thing?
It's not easy. I mean, that's what I would say. I mean, this, we're talking about, key principles and things that we can learn, and it's easy to put a nice bullet point down on a PowerPoint presentation, but it's not as easy in practice. I think that's where it comes down to leadership, and one of the first things that we did around COVID-19 was very much focused internally on our own people and on our customers, and understanding what their concerns were. Now, I mean, doing the right thing by our people, you're dealing with a health crisis here. You want to be doing absolutely everything that you can to take care of your people, and there's a cost that comes with that. The second thing is with your customers, and this is where we didn't have all the answers.
No, you did.
Because I think the transport sector in particular has had a difficult time with this, and you'll have seen airlines have had a challenge around about maintaining their business model at the same time as having to deal with the fact that there's lots of refunds have to go out the door. So there's a process that you've got to follow there. The other thing is around leadership, in terms of showing that this is a crisis where your senior people are also sharing the pain. I mean, we put out a regulatory announcement very early on about the pay cuts that we were taking, no bonuses, no pay rises next year, because when you're asking your people in a transport environment, like doctors and nurses have been doing, putting themselves out in the front line, the least you can do is show that you are setting some sort of an example and doing what you can to have sort of solidarity with them. So I think these sort of things were some of the things that we definitely tried to do early on.
So it's a classic example of where your actions must match your words. You can have the finest words in the world, but if they're not backed up by leadership action, they're going to be seen to be hollow.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're about halfway through my questions. I'd encourage people on the end of the line also to pose their questions via the question or chat pane. I know we have a couple already, but in about 15 minutes time, we'll be turning to questions from the audience. So do please send those in as we're going through the discussion. I'd like to explore in a little bit more detail the kind of internal communication challenges and how you approach that, Steve. As you say, your employees were very, very directly and literally on the front line of this, I'm sure, with many concerns for their lives, but also, for their careers and their families and everything else. How did you go about addressing that internal communications challenge?
I mean, I think a lot of this has come down to relationships, and again, going back to the issue around about CEO visibility. I mean, just starting with that point, we've been very conscious to make sure that our chief executive has had a regular dialogue with our people. I mean, we've got good, really high uptake of our social media platform, Blink, by our people. So we've had our chief executive blogging regularly. We've had him doing video comments that have gone out, and we also, within the past few weeks, because the first few weeks you really are driven by events quite a lot.
Yes.
But a few weeks ago, we had an opportunity to take stock. We were picking up through our internal social media channels the kinds of issues that were preying on people's minds. I mean, after the initial shock of this, people turned to job security, things like that. So we organised an opportunity where there was a sort of open to question session. No question was out of bounds. I think we had a lot of duplicate questions, but we probably had around about 100 different areas that people were interested in raising. We put these questions, the broad topics, there was probably around about a dozen to 15 topics, to our chief exec. He spoke very clearly about them. He was very honest. Where he didn't have answers, he didn't try to claim he had answers. He didn't sugarcoat things. And also, he talked in a very human way. I mean, one of the things that resonated with me was that we were in this environment. I think we were at that point maybe five weeks into lockdown. We knew that our people, like anyone else, would be struggling a bit. And he talked about how he felt as a father, how he felt as a son of his dad who was in his 80s. And we got a huge amount of positive feedback from our people. And also the more formal channels with our trade unions. I mean, trade unions, they have a critical role in protecting the safety of people. We made sure that they were very much part of the conversation. And largely, we've been able to work extremely constructively with them on some of the enhancements that we've put in place around about employee safety.
I'm going to pick up one of the questions that's just come in, Steve, because it relates directly to what we're just talking about. It's from Gus, and he asks, you have a mobile workforce, each one of them a potential unofficial spokesperson. How did you keep them informed on a regular basis? And how did you measure if they were properly sharing your messaging?
Yes, very good question. I've got to say the Blink tool, which is an app that every single employee can download to their phone, was critical, because that actually has given us an opportunity to deploy different types of messages, both ones at a sort of top strategic level from our chief exec, right through to ones that are more on the front line, depot-led or local company-led. And that actually allows us to get their feedback as well. So it was a two-way conversation. I think one of the things about, how are we measuring how they were, absorbing that message and projecting it. I mean, we had one level of measurement through the app. I mean, we were very closely monitoring what was being said in the media. Largely, actually, our people didn't tend to talk to the media. Some of them did about their their fears, as I think anyone would. And I think the key thing there is that we didn't do that sort of knee-jerk, get on employees' backs. I think you've got to embrace that. And actually what we did was we actually started to take what I would call a bit of a calculated risk. We had loads of approaches from the media to talk to our people. Obviously, we knew people who were good communicators. We also knew people that had a sensible head on their shoulders. We did not try to gag them in any way. We gave them a platform to talk honestly about what it was like, for example, being a bus driver in the front line. And I think that transparency actually helps you as an organisation.
Yeah.
It means that you're a lot more believable. And when you actually give formal messages about safety, etc., you've actually got people that are on the front line backing you up.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And would you say, therefore, that your Blink app, is that now your kind of number one way of getting messages to your employees quickly, or are there other ways if you needed to brief them on something super quickly that you would use?
It's certainly one of the quickest ways. I mean, we still do face-to-face. I mean, we do have our depots are, with social distancing are obviously still running. We've got an emergency bus network, so we do have that face-to-face communication as well, with our people, where we can give them sort of short key messages. There's been a lot of information though that we've had to, like I'm sure a lot of people on the call in different areas, get to them around about new safe ways of working, information about workplaces as we plan to go back, the changes to what they do in our operational terms on the ground every day. So there's been a mix of face-to-face and digital. Digital has really been important for us though, because of the amount of people that we've had to communicate with. And also, don't forget, I mean, we've had 55% of our engineers and drivers furloughed. I'm sure there's lots of organisations on the call who've had employees who are not currently in the workplace. Don't forget about communicating the same information with them. It's important they feel part of that family. Yeah.
And did you actively prioritize your stakeholder groups? Did you determine these are the most important groups that we must communicate with?
Yes, I mean, in a crisis, I mean, every one of these groups has got a certain level of priority. I mean, our people were first, and our customers, but also in terms of external stakeholders, one right up there was government. I mean, we've all seen it in terms of the support that the government or taxpayers, because in the end it's taxpayers that are paying for it, are giving to various sectors. I mean, we understood quite quickly that we needed to get in there to make our voice heard, because there was going to be a long queue at the door. So it was very important for us to work with our sector body and be speaking to government. They were a really key stakeholder, because at the end of the day, some of the decisions that they were making around about social distancing and advice not to use public transport had a direct commercial impact.
Yeah. I am going to feed in another question from someone in the audience, because again, I think it relates in a slightly different way to what we've just been talking about, because it's a people question. So it comes from Louise, and she says, how have you and your senior team been managing your own energy and resilience, as this is an ongoing situation rather than a short, sharp shock? How are you looking after yourselves at a senior level?
Very good question, and one that we've been very conscious of right from the off. Our chief exec in the early weeks was conducting one-to-ones with a lot of the key people. Director of comms role here, even with some other individuals who were maybe at a level below that, just getting the pulse, how they were doing, how they were feeling. Also, I think, and that's continued. I mean, he regularly has a Friday afternoon catch up, and he'll say, I want to see you with a glass of beer in your hand when I'm talking to you on Microsoft Teams. He understands that we're putting in the hours. I think in individually as well. I mean, this is one of these crises where it's not one of these things that's over in a week. It's gone on and on and on, and you almost have to have a bit of a shift working mentality that you take a day, if depending on the size of your team, of course, you take a day here and there to recharge your batteries. I mean, I for my sins of for the past year, I've been trying to learn how to play guitar. So I'll pick it up and take my mind off what I'm trying to do for a bit. You just need that headspace and thinking time.
Yes. And another question on the people side from Jane, who asks, reflecting on what you've done over the last 8 weeks, from an internal communication perspective, what one or two things would you do differently if you had to do it all over again?
Oh, that's difficult, actually, still being in the heat of it.
Yes.
I think most things. I think I talked about that human side and showing your human side to your people. What we've tried to do, and you'll have seen it come through in the media, is around about the role of key workers, and we tried to play up. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus, quite rightly, on the health and social care sector, but we really tried to get the profile of our people up so that we gave them a public thank you. So we ended up having an industry bus and coach workers day, sort of along the lines of the way that the health services rightly been recognising their people. I think that's been really important. I think we maybe could have, as an industry, been quicker off the mark to recognise and actually be describing them as key workers before others did. Because I think recognition in this kind of an environment is really important for people's morale.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, anything that's surprised you in terms of how this situation has played out, or how the communication has played out, Steve?
I think the speed of developments. I mean, I was talking earlier on about how quickly it's moved from one environment to another. The dominance and importance of internal communications. Internal communications is not my background. It's something that I'm involved with now, but it wasn't my background. It's a media background I've had. And I think actually that it's been one of these crises where it's flipped on its head. Internal has been more important because that's driven how things have panned out externally. I was actually quite surprised at how long the political consensus out there has lasted before it started to break down. And now we've got different challenges across different bits of the UK, which I think for any organisation that's got a pan-European perspective, it's one of the things that we all need to be very aware of, because individual governments like their place. I think the other thing I've been absolutely astonished at is the resilience, adaptability and positivity of people. I mean, normally in a crisis, and in this crisis there has been the same. There's been the pointing of fingers about how did all this happen in terms of deaths in care homes? Were we quick enough to do testing? There's all the pointing of fingers, but I think what I enjoyed seeing is the positivity about rewarding and recognising the response of people across the country to the crisis, and that's something that we've certainly tried to do.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I'm going to feed in another question here from Jonathan, not me, but Jonathan Edwards. Do you think organisations have suffered more now because they failed to plan properly following the near misses that were SARS and swine flu? Should organisations have been better prepared? I'm happy to comment on that as well, but feel free to pitch in, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that we were necessarily as prepared as we could have been. I mean, a health pandemic was on our risk register. We had experience of it with SARS, but I still wouldn't say that our response was perfect, because I think we, even with the experience of SARS, we just, and probably no one could have, we just didn't have any inkling that we were going to be into an environment where staying 2 meters apart from people was how we're going to live our lives in the immediate future. So I think that's another thing about crisis planning. You have to understand that you can't plan for everything. No. So the principles that we talked about earlier on, and that you learn from doing scenario planning and exercising, they're the things that will help. It's not knowing everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the points I was going to make, that actually, if you had a good crisis management plan going into this situation, that would have carried you quite a long way. In our experience working with a number of organisations during this situation, those that had a specific pandemic plan undoubtedly had a significant head start. Those with a crisis management plan of any kind, had a significant head start, and those without a plan of any kind largely were scrambling and reacting and wishing that they had a plan. So again, to Steve's point, you can't predict everything. Pandemic was certainly something that could have been planned for. What I would encourage people to think about going forward is, in the absence of being able to predict and plan for every scenario, think instead of some of the potential impacts of a crisis. So, being unable to travel internationally is an impact that might occur for a number of different reasons. In this case, it was because of a virus. How many years ago? It was about 10 years ago. It's because of a volcano erupting. The supply chain dried up for lots of organizations, in this case because people were not able to go to their normal places of work, factories, or produce things in the same way, and things couldn't be imported from overseas. Again, for those of you with long enough memories, we had a petrol shortage, again, about 10 years ago. So one of the ways of making sure that your planning is flexible and fluid is to think about what would harm our business most in terms of the impact, not necessarily what is the specific situation that might occur that I have to plan for. So, so thank you for that question, Jonathan. I hope that addresses it. So 1 or 2 more questions from me, and Jim, I'm going to come to your question in the last 5 or 10 minutes, because I think it's quite a nice wrap-up question. So, Steve, as we start to look at the situation now, the easing of lockdown, people starting to use public transport now, what is your approach to communication in this coming phase?
Well, first of all, it's the sort of continuation of a regular stream of communication. So this is, you're in an environment where you're building on what you've done already. And actually, I actually think that this is a more challenging bit in the conversation with all the different stakeholders. And in some senses, the challenge is just beginning, because when you hunker down, it's been very clear what we've all needed to do. That stay-at-home message that the government had was very, very clear. Now, as we come out, there's already rumblings about whether the messaging that the government has had has been right. But for individuals and organisations that have got their own stakeholders to deal with, it's really important that we give clarity for customers, in particular, about what are we asking people to do, and also how we reassure them about their return to the new environment. We're in the middle of just putting out a lot of comms around about that, and you're actually going back to basics. You're actually going back to telling people or guiding people as to how they can do what they used to do with your product, but now in a totally different way. And they're having to change how they do things, which will make it uncertain. So having very clear guides and information about what they do. I think the other thing is this balance between people's fear and also trying to get them to live their lives a bit more normally. So then sometimes that can actually bring you into conflict with the people that are setting the rules. I mean, my personal view is that, and I think it's a view of our industry, is that the government has been a wee bit too hard on the don't use public transport message because of its concern about London. When in actual fact, there's a different environment in the regions outside London. So understanding that there are regional differences, I think, is really important, and making sure that you communicate in the right way in these different environments. Again, it's being honest with everyone, because some things we're not going to be able to control. I mean, it could be the case that we're all getting ready to open up the economy and start to get back to normal, and there's another spike, and we have to go and do something different. And that's why the regular communication is important. And I think a very important thing, and it's really important for everyone throughout this, our employees, customers, etc., government, is to thank them for what they've been doing, the changes that they've been making, the impact that they've had to endure, the flexibility that they've shown, the patience they've shown throughout all of this to try and maintain that good relationship with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a bit of a sort of a social contract thing. I mean, I for our customers, I think it's very clear what we want to get across them. We want to show them what we are doing for them to help them live their lives in the new normal, and guide them on what we need from them, whether it's our people or our customers, to help us all keep safe.
Yes. Question from Sue Fry, who asks, do you have any lessons learned that will help support you in planning for a second wave of the pandemic if it occurs? And maybe if I can expand on that, any broader learnings or lessons that you will take forward into future crisis communication. So learnings that will help with the second wave, and learnings in general that will inform future communication in a crisis.
I think the big learning for us personally has been at an industry level on two fronts, because in a lot of crises, the crisis could be one that is affecting your own organisation and no one else. When it's of a scale where it's your entire sector that is at threat of going under, you need an ability to work collectively, and that can be really challenging. I mean, we've got lots of different companies in our sector. We've got our different views on how things should or shouldn't be, but unity in dealings with government are really important. I think secondly, in terms of the ability to keep business going, we actually didn't really have an understanding of the complexities of how that would work out in practice. So just to explain that, you can get an announcement from the government at one of the news briefings that they hold every day to say that, in our case, £167 million in financial support was going to go into the industry, which is positive, but that involves mechanisms. It involves the wheels of civil servants turning. It involves brains and companies understanding how do we channel that money? How's the process going to work? and I think it's shown us that we were not really prepared enough for that practical stuff.
Mm-hmm. So I promised I would come to Jim's question, and the reason I've left it till last is because it's kind of a personal bugbear of mine, or certainly a personal concern. And so Jim's question, Steve, is, are you concerned that because of COVID, everybody is so busy problem solving, bailing out the boat, that not enough attention is being paid to lessons learnt, planning for when COVID is over, updating crisis plans, taking notes on actions and decisions to support what will be post-COVID reviews and inquiries? Would be interested to hear your views on this.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a huge, no doubt, public inquiry about the response of the country to all of this. I think one of the things that we always do as a matter of course after any major crisis that we deal with as a company is to have a wash-up session on it, and yes. I would expect our whole industry and other industries will be doing that. I mean, I remember in 2005, I think it was, when the London bombings took place, you know, the sort of hand-wringing that there was, and all the different things that we looked at, and we have learned a lot out of that. I think that as well as the sort of making sure you're prepared for the next crisis, I think the other important thing is that a crisis like this, the danger is it gets in the way of what your long-term strategy is. Yeah. Don't lose sight of what actually you were planning to do before yes. this. Obviously, you've got to take account of the fact that it may be more challenging, the finances, etc. But in public transport, for example, I mean, we're already thinking, how do we pivot this agenda to getting back to decarbonisation? How do we use this crisis to draw a line in the sand about public health and air quality? How do we, you know, point people to the fact that, you know, it's been terrible human loss of life. You know, over 35,000 yes. people have died from COVID-19. But as a country, we seem to accept that every year 40,000 people die from air pollution. So I actually think, as well as being prepared for the next, what I would call, crisis that hits you, using what you've learned from this to actually find a way forward for the challenges that have always been there, but for some reason we've never got ourselves together addressing. And that's where you tap into the fact that out of a crisis comes opportunity. Yes, and as you say, not allowing yourself simply to react and follow the path of the crisis in the long term, but exactly as you've said, remaining true to your longer term vision, learning from the crisis, yes, but not being diverted down a track that you didn't necessarily want to go down. Steve, I've got kind of 5 minutes of housekeeping to cover in the last few minutes of this session, but before doing that, I wanted to thank you so much for giving up your time when clearly the crisis is still rumbling on. There's still much work to do, and I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your busy schedule to talk with everyone on this webinar today. I think it's really feels like we've got privileged access to someone who's very much on the front line of this issue. And I just thank you so much for your candor, for your experience, for your insights, and I think also for some really practical guidance that other organisations can apply. So thank you so much for joining us today. No problem. I enjoyed it. Excellent. So in the last 4 or 5 minutes, I just wanted to give you all a preview of our next webinar and actually some, I hope, helpful follow-up to some of the issues raised on this webinar. So in 2 weeks' time, we have joining us Amanda Coleman, who is the recently former Head of Corporate Communications at Greater Manchester Police. Amanda was the Head of Corporate Communications when the Manchester Arena attack took place, and she is going to be sharing some really powerful and fascinating insights into crisis management from a different
perspective. So again, I would very much encourage you to sign up for that session. I also wanted to remind you of some of the resources that we have available to you to pick up on some of the topics covered on this webinar. In fact, we have a new section of our website specifically dedicated to how to protect your business in the wake of COVID-19. There's both details of services on there, but there are also resources there. If you've not heard enough of my voice and can bear to see my face as well, there are a number of short videos just giving hints, tips, insights to help you navigate your way through what is likely to happen next. There are free checklists, plans, resources that you can download. You don't even need to leave an email address in order to download those resources. So I would commend you to have a look at those as well. And yes, there are services. If you require consultancy advice, arms, legs, or brains at this time, we have a COVID-related brochure where you can see all of our services that sit across these 4 areas of assessment, planning, training, and exercising. And to Jim's question earlier on, I really would encourage you to take the time now to sit down, work out what's gone really well in our crisis response that we must retain within the business going forward. What didn't go so well? What resources are we missing? What was really difficult to do? Capture that and make changes to your crisis management and crisis communication plans now, because sadly there's every likelihood you are going to need them again in the not too distant future. And based on Winston Churchill's saying of never letting a good crisis go to waste, you really want to act on the back of those learnings that you have derived from this situation. So do take a look at the website. I think you'll find some really useful and interesting information there. Alternatively, drop me a line, give me a call, follow me on Twitter. I'd be more than happy to pick up with you directly and follow up on any of the matters that have been brought up in this session. Aside from that, thank you all for giving up your time today and for joining this webinar, and I very much hope to see you again in a couple of weeks' time. So thank you and have a safe afternoon.